Good morning. This is Jason Dean here at Film Fanatic, coming at you from the main headquarters here. Hope everyone's doing good. It is a Tuesday around 9:16 in the morning. So yeah, I want to thank everybody for the support for this channel. It's been great. There's been more videos that have been reaching the thousands of viewers, and there's been more people commenting on these videos, so that's been really cool. Again, like I've said before, it's really at the end of the day always about the movies I love, and just trying to share the enthusiasm and the passion that I love, that I have for a lot of these films, and that I also love the it's not really about the channel per se. It's hopefully maybe bringing light to certain films that people might have not have seen, or films that I feel to a degree have been overlooked. And I try to mix things up. So this is a specialty show that I'm going to do. I've been doing these little one-off shows. I did a James Cameron one. I did one on the Aliens franchise box set, the quadrilogy, which is mainly, that show was mainly featured, or the focus of that show was all about like the special features kind of application that is a component that usually comes with a lot of great Blu-rays, and that one in particular is my favorite of all time. So I wanted to do a show just on that, and that was a lot of fun. So and then I did a show also about kind of where the state of reviews are and social media and how that plays a part into making or break a to a degree, makes or breaks a movie at a box office, and also the fallout afterwards, and then certain films that are trashed initially and then, or don't, never find an audience or don't make any money, and then over a period of time they find an audience, and it takes on this cult like status. I did a show on Stanley Kubrick, my favorite director of all time. So I try to mix things up here, along with the typical regular review series and shows that I do. So cheers, and I really appreciate people coming by and checking out the stuff. Today's show is on a pretty sad and somber note. My friend Nikki, I was talking with her last night, who is a really great friend, and she's really supportive of all of these strange things that I do with Quantum and my film page. She was the one who first told me, but Angelo Badalamenti passed away yesterday. And I wanted to do a show today, this morning, where I'm just going to talk about Angelo Badalamenti. And I'm going to just share, for what it's worth, share my thoughts, feelings about him as a composer, as a writer, as an artist. Share some ideas about what his whole thing has meant to me, and also the inspiration that he's always given me, and for all that being said, for millions and millions of people out there. David Lynch, the director he's most known for working with and for. So yeah, so many things to kind of dive into. The first time I heard or came across David Lynch and also Angelo Badalamenti, I remember when I was in middle school. At this point, about 1,000 years ago, I there was a show that came on. It was on cable, and it was called Twin Peaks. And I'm sure everybody out there knows of this show. There's a lot of folks who probably don't know maybe who Angelo Badalamenti is, or what he did and his extensive work. But I think everybody and their grandmother probably knows Twin Peaks. That was such an unusual time. It was from my recollection, like it was the first like television show that I remember watching at such a young age, and it was so incredibly strange and also just incredibly beautiful all at the same time. And famously, it was directed by David Lynch. One of my all-time favorite directors. He's made so many great films: Eraserhead, Wild at Heart, Blue Velvet. Blue Velvet is personally my favorite of all of his films. Lost Highway, Twin Peaks: Come Fire Walk with Me, the Twin Peaks movie, The Elephant Man, another one that I feel is one of his most underrated movies. It's also one of my favorite David Lynch movies. Um, so many films, so many films. Mulholland Drive, one of his later films. I pretty much have all of his films on Blu-ray and DVD. Like I said, Blue Velvet is my favorite. And he's famously, and he also did Dune, the first version of Dune, but he also had a real, David Lynch had a big partnership with Kyle MacLachlan. He kind of started his career with Blue Velvet and then Dune, and after that, Kyle MacLachlan became a pretty famous actor and is still like a prolific actor. I've seen him. I recently saw him in a movie fairly that just came out maybe a couple of years ago. He's done all kinds of work, and he's always been one of my favorite kind of character actors. But Twin Peaks was such an unusual show, not conventional by any means. It was definitely like steeped in kind of like this avant-garde, dreamlike quality, and it had this beautiful kind of juxtaposition, which whenever I think of David Lynch's work and especially Angelo Badalamenti's compositions as a composer, I just feel like with those what those guys did, and especially Angelo Badalamenti, because music was such an integral part to all of his movies and also Twin Peaks. There was always this like juxtaposition of so many emotions, and I feel like it really represented, at least for me in my world, it represented kind of the true human experience, meaning that there was always this juxtaposition between you know these emotional shifts and showing the darkness and the light, and always being in this place between, or like this waking state between nightmares and dreams. There was always this kind of middle ground that I felt like those guys always took, where it could be any of those given emotions at any given time. And for me, that was, even at a young age, I was like, this is what it's like to be human. It's not, there's not, nothing is really black and white. It's all, people are mostly in the middle, uh, you know, as far as experiencing the gamut of all of our, kind of emotions that we have. And I remember seeing Twin Peaks when I first saw it. The thing that took me back the most, or that the thing that moved me so much, was the score from Angelo Badalamenti. It was so, again, all juxtaposition. It was so haunting and kind of scary, but it was also just sublime and beautiful and just gorgeous and lush. And it just had all of those components all put together. I don't remember, and even now it's something I don't hear that often in music or composition, where you have such a gamut of a wide range, a gamut of emotions all kind of put into one particular score or movement of music. And years later, after I, loved that show, the other thing that was so incredibly wild about that show, Twin Peaks in particularly, it was such an unusual show. It was such a strange show, but so gorgeous and beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The fact that that show was embraced by middle America is still, for me to this day, is kind of blows my mind. Like at one point, I remember that show became number one on all the networks. It was the top show back in the days of cable, and they were like on the cover of Rolling Stone. I remember back when talk show hosts like Phil Donahue existed and all those kinds of things like Geraldo. I remember seeing, and like Phil Donahue's show was like the biggest kind of talk show at that time. And I remember he had the whole cast, from Twin Peaks on there for like the entire hour, and they were just, talking about the show. David Lynch was on the show, Angelo Badalamenti, all the actors, and basically they were just talking about what this strange television show was. And Phil Donahue was like the most kind of white bread middle America, kind of working class television show that there was. It was all about talking about, to a degree, like social issues, but it was also a very, kind of commercially run show where they talked about things that were popular and things that were embraced by, the mass audience, and particularly in the States at the time, or America. They never really did anything where they talked about things that were issues, or artists or musicians or filmmakers that, they never gave light to things that were be considered to be kind of avant-garde, or on the fringe side of things. And for me, Twin Peaks was all about that. It took a look, to a degree, at kind of the American dream, and exposing it for it actually kind of being the American nightmare. That's always one thing I kind of got from that television show. Everything, you have this picturesque society or environment, but underneath there's something troubling, bubbling to the surface, or something really dark, a dark secret. But it's just under the surface of this kind of beautiful canvas, or this beautiful, picture on a canvas. And to me, that was the American reality. And to this day, that's how I picture the American reality to be. And for me, they captured that. And I remember just being pulled into that right away at such a young age. I was probably like 11 or 12 years old when that show came out. Probably younger, actually. It was before I was in high school. So, but like I said, it remains for me to this day baffling and just unbelievable how this strange little show was at one point, as American as apple pie, and was embraced by everyone, by people who would, watch the Super Bowl, or people who would, go to their regular sporting events and work their regular 9 to 5 jobs, and have, a house and a mortgage, and be married, and have this very conventional kind of straight life. And also, having tastes that tended to be, more or less what other people were, listening to or watching. So this thing came out of nowhere. Twin Peaks came out of nowhere and just like lit this fire. And after that show, I became obviously a huge David Lynch fan, and like I think the first movie I saw of his was Wild at Heart, with Laura Dern and Nicolas Cage and Willem Dafoe. That remains also one of my favorite David Lynch films. And also, to a degree, when I was a kid, like I've talked about it a lot too, where I love all kinds of music, whether it's world music, I really love listening to jazz. Particularly stuff in the '60s and '70s, and even the '50s, the earlier kind of blue note swing stuff, modern stuff. I grew up listening and playing heavy metal music, death metal, thrash metal, and then eventually I got into the whole black metal scene. I love hip hop a lot. I grew up listening to a lot of hip hop and rap at the time. I had friends that were DJs. Also, techno was it was the early stages of techno music. That's how I got introduced to that style of music. I also had friends that were DJing at that time, and it was kind of this new thing. So I was always into different kinds of music. And my favorite style of music was, especially now, has, and it has been for a while, is electronic music. That's the music I always kind of put on, and that's the music I always go to. I find myself, I don't necessarily have to be certain, there's certain things, certain kinds of music or whatnot, like film. You might have to be in a certain mindset or crave a certain kind of style in that moment. So you're like, okay, I'll put this on because this will like, this is where my headspace is at. But for me, electronic music, I can just kind of put it on any time of the day or night and just be into it. Same thing with jazz. But being now, like for me with the band Quantum, like I write all the music I write now and that I have been writing is all obviously I try to put in bring to a lot of different influences that of music that are non-electronic. But for a long time and even now, and I will continue doing it, I most of the all of the music I write for the most part is all in the electronic music style or vein for my band Quantum. And I remember my earliest recollections of being turned on, or like when I first heard anything that was any kind of music that involved synths or like any kind of electronic music. The first album I remember ever buying as a kid that was my first, quote unquote electronic album or electronica was Violator by Depeche Mode. You know, one of my all-time favorite bands, one of the most pioneering bands in the world of electronic music. David Gahan, who's the singer for Depeche Mode, is my all-time favorite singer of all time. He's the guy who is probably the biggest source of inspiration for me in Quantum as far as trying to sing. I don't really consider myself a singer, but attempting to do that. But he's like I have many other influences, but David Gahan is the guy for me. So I remember that was like technically the Depeche Mode's Violator. I remember buying that as a kid on cassette, and I had never heard anything like it before. It was so new, it was so fresh. I'd never been exposed to any kind of electronic music. It was even before I got exposed to techno, house music, and things of that nature. And the first time I would say I ever heard like synth music, of where I considered it, and I do consider it now, part of that world, part of the electronica world, was Angelo Badalamenti, especially around Twin Peaks, where it was all this real heavy synth stuff, and it had this real, just this incredible atmosphere around it. So, as a kid, my earliest recollections of being exposed to what I called then and even now to electronica music or electronic inspired music was Depeche Mode's Violator and Angelo Badalamenti's music for Twin Peaks. That was like for me what kind of started it as far as like the attraction to music in a way that for me it was like this real emotional thing. And kind of the rest is history. But after Twin Peaks, like I said, I got into Wild at Heart, and after that, I got totally obsessed with David Lynch, and I tried to seek out and find all of his movies. And I realized he was at that time he was really prolific. He was putting out all kinds of movies, and it was just an amazing, just a pure magical period because during that time I remember I was in I think I was in high school when Wild at Heart came out, and it was the first David Lynch movie I had seen. His first film that he had put out was I should say Eraserhead. I didn't see Eraserhead until many years later, and that movie just totally messed me up. That's just such an intense mind trip of a movie. And at that time, David Lynch was, a real prolific director, and he was, putting out all kinds of great films. So I just, got obsessed with his work for, during that whole period. And, in the subsequent years that followed, the last, well, I should say the last few years, I've, bought most of all of his movies on Blu-ray. Blue Velvet being the first, I think was the first one I bought on Blu-ray, and that's always been my favorite. That stars also Laura Dern and Kyle MacLachlan, and to me it's a film noir, but it really emphasizes that whole experience of, there isn't all the characters like there you do have the archetype of where there's a hero and the villain to a degree in the film, but each character has so many different shades. They all have like good things and also terrible things about their character. So it just has this whole world that you would be pulled into of where suddenly you're caring about these characters, but then also questioning, their motives, the reasons behind some of their actions, but yet you have sympathy towards all of them and you care about all of them. And with the haunting score that was composed by Angelo Badalamenti and also the music that was used, it just magnifies that whole experience. So, many, many years later, after, watching all of his films and collecting them and just being obsessed with David Lynch, and, even today he remains easily one of my favorite directors, of all time. One of the most innovative directors ever. So unconventional, but at the same time, again, with all the characters that he's, introduced to the world over the years and all through all of his films, there's just this element of just exquisite beauty and exquisite darkness, and it's all, this strange amalgamation and zeitgeist of all of those colors. So many, many years later, well, I should say during that time too, I also, along with buying many of his movies and watching all of his films, and I started buying a lot of his films, like when DVDs started becoming a craze, and like in my 30s or so, I started buying a lot of his DVDs, and then the last 7 or 8 years, I started buying Blu-rays of his films, and I should say more recently. I got into the whole Blu-ray craze, kind of, at the tail end of it. So now that's what I have a pretty extensive collection of most of his films. And so fast forward, during that time, many years later, I started to have this idea of forming my one of my dreams. It really is. It's like it's kind of always been a lifelong dream, but even at a young age, I always had this dream of maybe, creating my own band where I was like kind of the front man, but I was like creating all the music, and I could have this, create it around, or have this like theatrical presentation around it. And it's strange thinking about that because even at a young age, I had just got exposed to certain bands and music that I liked, like I mentioned Depeche Mode's Violator, the work of Angelo Badalamenti. Even before I got into film and many other styles of music, I just had this vision. I had this vision in my head that one day I'd love to start my own project where I could have this, kind of theatrical presentation of the ideas that I have in a musical context. So it was really, something I always wanted and something I always thought about. The other inspiration too during that time, as far as like taking on, maybe doing a project even at a young age where I thought about it. The other group that was a real influence was Kiss, because Kiss was like larger than life. I was like millions of other kids. I was a super comic book nerd, and suddenly when I saw this band called Kiss, they were like living, breathing comic book characters, and I was just like blown away. So that really, influenced me as far as on the theatrical side of things. So like it was really those three things, which is kind of an odd combination when you think about it. Like Kiss, Depeche Mode, and Angelo Badalamenti. Like it was like a weird combination of all of those three things that really, you know, left this imprint on me. And years later, when I started, if you want to call it my music career, and I started playing in bands, and I started doing like professional gigs, and I went to Berkeley, and I did a lot of things, and I was trying to move my life more into that direction. I was knee deep in playing with other people's projects. I was basically the drummer for lots of bands, and I was doing a lot of pickup gigs where certain bands that were maybe fairly established in the area or whatnot, their drummers were sick or they couldn't do a gig, so they would call me and I would do those gigs. And then I started playing in bands where I was like the regular drummer, and most of that time, during that time, the projects were, original, or I should say, were like cover bands. We were doing like classic rock or cover tunes, famous popular pop tunes even at the time, and so I was doing that for years and years. And then I had a little bit of a taste with a couple of projects of where I had the experience of actually, writing music on my own and presenting it to the band, and we would play this material. And I did that a little bit here and there. And then at one time, there were two projects that I was involved with where that became a regular thing, and it was really inspiring. And I just kept going into trying to focus on that more and more. And then eventually, my life changed a lot, and suddenly I kind of got out of that circle of musicians and bands that I was playing with, where we were doing covers and I was suddenly out of the situation of where I was more or less performing other people's material, and I was like basically starting from scratch, starting at zero. And I had acquired a few, I had my first keyboard, my electronic, my microKORG, which was my synth that I've had for a long time and I still use now. I had bought a couple of drum machines, and suddenly I had all of this time and freedom to to kind of to do more or less whatever I wanted to do. And so I had this idea, well, maybe I can have a go of trying to. And by that point too, I was really obsessively listening to all kinds of electronic music, and I'd really gotten to film more and all those things. So I thought, well, okay, I have all this time. Maybe now is the opportunity that I can start my, electronic group or project that I had this, I've had this, this that was part of this vision that I've had, ever since I was a kid. It was really kind of a strange but kind of amazing, an amazing time. And I remember I would sit like on my couch, and this was coming from being so busy with other people's projects, and in particular one or two bands, or in particular one band that I was playing with all the time, to where that became a full-time project, and it was a really great experience. But I just got burnt out of it, and I just kind of needed to stop. And I remember when I had all this time, I would sit on my couch with my keyboard, and I have a little setup thing, and I connect everything together, I realized that they were all Korg products. Korg is like an electronic company. They make keyboards and various drum machines and all kinds of things. But I realized the equipment that I had was all compatible, and I could hook everything up. I didn't realize that for a couple of years that I could do that. That I could actually take plugins from my keyboard and my drum machine and plug them all in together as one unit and use them as one piece. And when I came to that realization, I was like, oh wow, like this is really cool. I didn't realize that these were all Korg products and they can all work, together. So I would spend hours and hours and hours of where I would just literally sit on my couch and put this equipment on my coffee table. And I didn't even have a PA system or a sound system. I just basically had a set of headphones, and I would throw my headphones into it, and I'd listen, and I try to create all this, I try to create music. And at one point, like, when I first started doing it, I, had this massive, I guess you could call it, at that, leading up to that, I had pretty decent amount of experience writing music, but it was usually, collaborating with other people, and it was more in a traditional sense of with like guitar, bass, and so now it was literally just me, coming up with or trying to come up with material. So I went through this big bout of where I was kind of just like noodling and just kind of jamming and making things up. But I felt like over a period of 5 or 6 months, I started to get frustrated because I felt like I was hitting a brick wall and I wasn't really finding that voice or like finding any material that was presentable, that was good. And during that time, like I do now, I was watching movies and all these kinds of things. And I remember I had gone during that period. I had gone to the Opera House Video, which is a place I've talked about all the time. Opera House Video is the local video store here in Belfast, and it's been around for as long as I've been here, basically. And it's amazing that place still is going. But during that time, when I was kind of in this weird creative block, and I was having lots of fun and discovering all these new sounds, but I felt like I wasn't really honing in on anything that was like actual material. I remember going to Opera House Video, and they had just I saw on their shelves they had the entire first season of Twin Peaks on DVD, and I was like, oh wow, like because I still to this day love David Lynch. I love David Lynch then, and Angelo Badalamenti, because I had I'd been listening to I had Twin Peaks, Blue Velvet, a bunch of soundtracks of Mulholland Drive, Lost Highway. I basically tried to get all of the soundtracks for all of of his films, and I acquired all of those, and I used to listen to those all the time. And I remember renting the first season of Twin Peaks, and I watched it, and I hadn't seen the whole series in such a long time. And I was just completely blown away by how just incredible it was. I was totally inspired, but I found myself really, really, really focusing on the music by Angelo Badalamenti. I was just like, this is like some of the most gorgeous and horrific music I've ever heard. It's so, again, juxtaposition, the light and the darkness, this whole gamut of emotions, and I was just like blown away by how engaging and how powerful the music was for Twin Peaks, especially the haunting main theme for the television show, which I think is just one of the most haunting things ever written. And so I watched that show and I was just blown away by it. And I was, like I said, I was especially drawn to listening to the music for that series. After I got done watching it, I started to, go back to went back to trying to work on this music I was creating. And suddenly I had all of these ideas. Suddenly I started writing you know, about before I knew it, after like a period of 5 or 6 weeks after watching that show, I had, you know, about 30 minutes or so of original material for what would be, and it was before I even had the name Quantum. I was, kicking around the ideas of what I'm going to call it and how I'm going to do it, but I needed to have some kind of voice or some kind of map to where as to what I was going to be doing or presenting it and have some material. And the material that I wrote was at that given time, and what I was listening to and what I was being exposed to was directly inspired by Angelo Badalamenti. And particularly, it was directly inspired by Twin Peaks and that score. And again, it was all this beautiful synth work. It was all electronica. And I was enamored with that, the sound and the textures and all of the emotions that he had in his music. And that was a direct influence. And suddenly I started to see that, okay, there's something here. I have some material now, and I remember I just became obsessed with working on it. And that was the kind of the creative spark that I needed. And I'll always, I'll never forget that situation. It's a cliche thing where artists, artists, or you use that term loosely, but or musicians, where if you're writing, you hit these walls or these roadblocks, and that's kind of part of the process. And then you kind of just, I find now, like when it happens, you just, you kind of just keep chipping away at it, even if, as many ideas as you come up with, there's 1,000 others that you end up like kind of throwing away, that kind of thing. And that's also kind of a cliche thing of the whole process. But I just started to, be inspired by that music and that television show, and it was, just an astounding experience. And even now, when I'm writing music, I go back to that period. I think of that, and so I attribute not only Angelo Badalamenti's work to inspiring just the music alone, and still to this day, in particularly in the first couple of years of that band. But I not only inspiring that music, like 100% of what I wrote, but had it also brought to reality the kind of the dream that I've always had as a kid of like, well, maybe I can, find my own voice and create my own thing. So, you know, with Angelo Badalamenti's passing, I mean, he was 85, 86. He was up there in age. My dad is 85. My dad is very healthy, but he, I, so looking back at his career and seeing that he just passed away without that experience of being such a fan and being so enamored with Angelo Badalamenti's music and his art, uh, I don't think Quantum would exist. I don't think, and it is for what it's worth, but, and I don't think this dream that I've always had of creating this band would be realized. So I pretty much, at the end of the day, like again, I have so many influences for that project and things that inspire me when I'm writing music and for what it is, in particular with film and bands and things like that. But I, at the end of the day, with those experiences, I owe everything to Angelo Badalamenti. Like, it was a profound experience of a dream realized, but then also actually creating my own voice. So I owe everything to Angelo Badalamenti. So I don't know of any other composers that have had that impact on me. There's, I mean, again, so many artists that do inspire me, but nothing at that level. No, I don't feel like there's ever been an artist that's captured that true, for me, the true kind of collective or human experience, or even the collective experience of like our human nature, where we're in the gray zone. We're not always good. We're not always bad. We have shades of all of these things. You know, like Carl Jung said, talked of like the shadow. You know, where there's always this essence of darkness in our motivations. And I feel like that was what Angelo Badalamenti represented in his art. So rest in peace, Angelo Badalamenti. I'm beyond indebted to your masterwork and your inspiration that is unmeasurable. So thank you again. This is Jason Dean, a film fanatic. Wanted to do this special show and a little bit of a tribute to the probably, for me, the greatest composer for movies and television ever, the great and the magnificent Angelo Badalamenti. We'll see you next time. Peace.